Thank you so much for your patience. And thank you to the AV folks for figuring this out for me. Good morning. Oh no, now, there we go. Okay, so computer audio is not working, but this is a test of whether YouTube's Content ID is going to take this offline, even though I took all these clips from YouTube. I'm Chester Wisniewski, and I'm here. I'm not here officially representing Sophos, but I did use our slide deck because my company was kind enough to pay for me to be here with you today. And I've been doing a lot of work with customers of ours around helping shore up some of their multi-factor and looking at ways that criminals have been continuously compromising them and sometimes bypassing multi-factor. So a lot of the information I'm presenting here today is, based on information from our customers and from my experiences working with them as part of our incident response teams, part of our managed detection response teams, etc. I've been at Sophos for about 20 years, so I'm a bit of a lifer here. And I think I presented here at B-Sides in 2019, so hopefully all of you can understand my crazy Canadian accent, and we'll do our best to get through all my content on time this morning. Let's try the audio again. No. So maybe Walter White's not going to co-present with me today, but maybe that'll stop YouTube from taking me down. So a quick agenda. I'm going to go through the most popular MFA methods and some of their weaknesses. I know some of you may already be familiar with a lot of the details, but I'm going to kind of quickly go through the basics that make most of them work. And then we'll talk about some of the more famous examples of how they've been bypassed that you may have seen some of the stories in the news around. And then I'm going to try to provide some advice based on my experience that, if nothing else, will make it more difficult to compromise or bypass multi-factor solutions you may be implementing to protect your information. So obviously, hopefully, if you're at Security B-Sides, you know what multi-factor is, right? We're trying to add something to authentication that includes physicality, so that obviously it makes it much more difficult for somebody to impersonate you, because it's not just a secret that can be stolen. And I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but we do have a lot of different approaches that we can take. And depending how old you are, I mean, there's a few folks in the room that probably are young enough that they may not have been born when I started working at Sophos. So you might not recognize all of these, but you probably started out by seeing one of these RSA tokens in your pocket, or perhaps the Nokia phone where you got your SMS 6-digit code texted to you back in the late 1990s or early 2000s. Of course, we've got a lot of other technologies now, right? We've got push notifications, we've got Google Authenticator kind of apps, we've got smart cards, we've got FIDO tokens, and of course, most of us have some sort of biometric device in our pockets, whether it's a Face ID on an iPhone or a fingerprint reader on your Samsung or whatever you might be using to authenticate to your phone that can also be deployed as another method of multi-factor. And if we look at how these things work, under the basic hood of most of them are a few essential things. Anytime we're entering in these 6-digit codes, in essence, we're relying on a pseudo-random number generator, right? And most of us that want to do cryptography are not big fans of pseudo-randomness. We want real randomness, but it turns out to be an advantage when we're using these applications. And whether it's an RSA token or whether it's that Google Authenticator app, most of the time, in essence, what you're getting is some sort of seed. And that seed is seeding the pseudo-random number generator to give a predictable set of seemingly random numbers. And because they're predictable, both sides can match them up and determine that they are in agreement about what that code is. I saw somebody probably took a picture of my QR code here, so you now know one of my Gmail accounts. That will not work. That is not the current authenticator on that account, but knock yourself out. I'll get the notifications later. It's fine. And a lot of folks, of course, want to back these up as well, right? Because I'm going to get a new phone, or I dropped my phone in the toilet. All of a sudden, I don't have my two-factor codes anymore. So a lot of people will take a screenshot of those QR codes and back them up so that they can restore them later. Personally, I prefer to go into the text mode and grab the 16 characters and put them into an encrypted file somewhere that I can store in my cloud storage, so I make sure I've got them handy for myself. But in essence, all that is the seed for that pseudo-random number generator. The one wild card here, of course, is we don't really know how the SMS codes are being generated. You would hope that it works on a similar concept, that when it texts you that number, it is truly some sort of randomness on the end of the company providing that through Twilio or whatever service they're using to send you the text messages. But my colleague and I actually, I think it might have been at B-Sides 2019, we both presented here, and we were playing with some of the SMS stuff, and it turns out one of our providers that SMS does texts was using sequential numbers from what we could tell. I would get a code, and it would be like 133121, and then he would do it at the same time and get 133124, and it's like, oh, 3 people between us must have just got a text message. This is another downfall, right? So clearly, if somebody can compromise the seed, they know exactly what's going to be on your display. So if they get access to your copies of the QR codes or the backed up letters because you store them insecurely, anybody can see what would have been there. But we also are relying on the providers of these services, like an SMS texting service, to actually securely generate the codes to begin with. And it's opaque to us. We have no idea how those codes may have been generated. So it's not the best thing in the world. And that's ignoring SIM swapping and, lots of other things. Biometrics. I don't know how many of you've studied the way biometrics are stored in our phones, but the good news is your fingerprint or your face is not actually copied up to the cloud somewhere. Apple does not have your face, and your Android phone has not uploaded your fingerprints for Google for easy storage at the NSA. Generally, they're sort of hash-based, right? They're trying to measure different things, hash those things, and store those hashes securely. Usually, those hashes are going to be stored in the secure element chip in your phone itself. So those hashes are not transmitted to the authentication provider themselves. And the secure element has a shared set of keys so it can securely communicate with the authentication authority to say, I verified that this fingerprint was read by me, and I'm now authenticating that this device and this fingerprint that belongs to this identity is in fact here. And if we look at the accuracy of this stuff, in general, in perfect conditions, it's about 99.97% accuracy against false negatives, right? So that means it most of the time will recognize your face unless you've had some kind of horrible accident. And the same with your fingerprints, of which I did cut part of my thumb off chopping stuff right before I left here. So, those things can happen. In the real world, it's around 87% because we all have a bit of grease on our fingertips and different things happen, or we get cold in the bad weather, and that can throw off the accuracy a little bit of things like fingerprint readers. Makeup can mess with face reading. These things happen. And if you were to take, there's quite a few of you in the room, actually, and if I guess that there's 256 of you in here, one of you probably could unlock my phone, because that's about the accuracy. They're intentionally fuzzy, inaccurate, because if they're too accurate, every time it snows and your fingerprint shrunk, you'd never unlock your phone. So they're intentionally a bit fuzzy, and one of the benefits of using a fingerprint biometric is that your fingerprints have no relationship genetically to any of your family members or anybody else, unlike your face. So if you do use face unlock on your devices, it's much more likely that your child or your cousin or your brother perhaps might be able to unlock your device if you think that's a security threat to you. Whereas your fingerprints, that's not true. Even twins have completely unique fingerprints that there's no matching of them at all. So the truly paranoid, if you're going to use biometrics, you might prefer fingerprints over face if you're worried about your kid unlocking your phone and buying $99 worth of things in the App Store. And then, of course, we have push notifications, and I think the vast majority of companies now have started moving this direction, whether you're using something like Duo Authenticator, Microsoft Authenticator, Google offers it, Apple has it built into their products as well for some of their services. And this is where you get the push notification. There's variations of it, of course. Sometimes it shows you a wildly inaccurate map because the IP address where you're at is not actually associated with the correct thing in their GeoIP database. More and more things are moving toward making you enter those digits in addition to the push notifications so that it's a little bit more difficult for somebody to impersonate or do a man-in-the-middle attack or a person-in-the-middle attack, that kind of thing. But in essence, they're trying to make it convenient as opposed to making you have to memorize 6 digits and enter them in and that type of thing. And of course, For the truly secure, we are using tokens a lot these days. Whether, and of course, YubiKey is probably the most common, popular ones, but Google makes the Titan keys. If you work for the government, certainly in the United States, you might have a smart card with an actual chip on it. That's the same chip that you're using your credit cards. If you're here for my 2019 talk on a safer way to pay, you learn all about how those chips work. You can see it on YouTube. And most of this, that's the most secure way. And we would refer to this ideally when we're talking about WebAuthn or U2F as a phishing-resistant method of authentication. And that's part of what I'm here to talk about this morning. So clearly, SIM swapping is the biggest risk for the things being texted to you, and we've seen this, and it amazes me that people who are smart enough to have millions of dollars worth of crypto also rely on text messages to secure their crypto wallets and have them repeatedly emptied by the North Koreans. It's shocking that people that thought NFTs were a good idea would make a mistake like that. But it's still a thing, and it is something to be aware of. All forms of multi-factor are better than no form of multi-factor, so I would never discourage someone if it's the only method available to them because maybe they are not wealthy enough to have a fancy smartphone. My parents are not very sophisticated. They don't know how to really use apps on their phone, and it's a very easy, accessible method to them. It's also an accessibility issue sometimes where, a lot of these services will call you on the phone and read you the 6 digits, for example, and that's it's just as problematic from a SIM swapping perspective as anything else, but it is an accessibility thing. For people that are visually impaired, that's a way that they can interact with these systems, and the other tools may not be available to them. So we shouldn't dismiss the 6 digits and especially SMS necessarily, because for some people it's an accessibility issue and it's good to provide it. But most of us are probably going to want to step up from that if we have another option available to us. You have the RSA problem, which of course is if the Chinese hack you and steal all the seeds for all the tokens you've ever made, you might question why a company that makes secure tokens would keep the seeds for all the tokens they've ever manufactured, but I'll leave that up to them to describe to you why they did that. But it kind of was a problem. And if you were like me, you might have a couple extra RSA tokens in your drawer at home now because I had to get replacements for all of mine due to that incident. But more than that, the other thing we've seen, and that's an actual screenshot. I don't have in my notes here. I think it was in 2006 I ran across this story of the guy who had outsourced his job to a laborer in Southeast Asia for pennies per hour. And because they had multi-factor, he set up his webcam on his RSA token so that the person doing his job for him could authenticate. So without picking on RSA, the company, this is another vulnerability of using this kind of method. Anybody that can see the digits can enter them, and it in no way actually verifies your identity in any meaningful way. It just means you found some way of getting the codes. And that could be the SIM swapping, it could be the webcam, it could be lots of different things. So it's less than ideal. It's also vulnerable to proxy, machine in the middle attacks, let's call them, right? And Microsoft reported a couple summers ago that they had over 10,000 companies using Office 365 that were compromised between September of 21 and July of 2022. And it was, less than 5 minutes for them to conduct a complete account takeover. And the way they did it was using a tool called EvilGenX. If you run the web server Nginx, there's a version of it on GitHub called EvilGenX that is specifically designed to be a proxy for multi-factor authentication. So they would send you the phishing email that you can see there that pretended to have an MP3 that was your voicemail, but thank you Windows in 2023 for still hiding file extensions. They sent it to you as a .mp3.html. And when you opened the .html file, of course, it would take you to the phishing site run on an EvilGenX instance that the attacker controlled, but send you the genuine Microsoft authentication for your corporate login. You would get the push notification to your phone, you'd enter 6-7 like you're supposed to, and you're completely compromised. And they would do that by stealing the cookies by being in the machine in the middle attack so that they would no longer need to have you authenticate with whatever authentication method you were using ever again, because once they have the cookie, until its lifetime has expired, they can now impersonate you on your O365 instance. So Microsoft documented this really well. If you're interested in the details of kind of how that attack unplayed, these fantastic graphics are from their sort of root cause analysis that they published. And these attacks are becoming a lot more common. I originally developed this presentation to present at B-Sides Las Vegas this summer, and then I got COVID and couldn't go. And at that time, when I was developing it, we started seeing a dramatic increase since June and July, when I originally created this content, of evil genetics being used in the wild in more and more attacks, because more and more of us are starting to deploy multi-factor, and it bypasses all types of multi-factor with the exception of phishing resistant, because you just pass the 6 digits through, or you get the push notification. I mean, it's a legit login. Of course, there's Uber's third hack. I can't map them all out for you. There's too many to recollect always. But in this particular case, a contractor's laptop was infected with a everyday Trojan that you might get from a malvertisement, or we don't really know what the source of that Trojan was that got on there. But in essence, they were put up on a marketplace for sale, that contractor's laptop, and Lapsus just purchased that employee's credential off the marketplace, and then tried to log into VPN. And of course, there was a push notification set up through Duo for that contractor. And I think in the report it said that they sent 320 successive push notifications until the person hit accept, because they got so sick of getting push notifications, they just wanted them to stop. But unfortunately, for Uber, they also happen to store their Thysotic password for their entire credential database, in a plain text script in a public directory in a file share. And that kind of unlocked the entire network. So there's several lessons to be learned here that are not multi-factor involved. But it shows that just having the push notification is still susceptible to this kind of nag attack, right? Like, how many times during dinner are you going to get dingle, 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 dingle before you just like make this stop? And unfortunately, making it stop granted Lapsus access to the network. And I'm going to skip Walter, because hopefully this won't get taken down from YouTube that way. Now it will, because I took the Cookie Monster. So that's where we're starting to see things moving in a new direction, right? The criminals are realizing that as we're developing better multi-factor, and as more of us are starting to use phishing-resistant multi-factor like WebAuthn or U2F or FIDO2 or YubiKey, whatever name you want to use for that technology, that, ultimately HTTP is a protocol without a state, right? Like, that's why we have to set cookies. Otherwise, we don't know who you are, because every request could be, there's 700 of us behind the Novotel IP address right now. Which one of us is logged into Gmail? There's no way for HTTP to know me from you when we're just looking at IPs, so we have to have cookies to track those session IDs. And that, of course, if you acquire it, bypasses multi-factor entirely, because once I have the session ID, the whole point is to not make me type my password and fingerprint for every single page load as I'm going through my workday when I'm logging into the website. And that's our vulnerability now. And the first really public example of that was, I believe in the summer of 2022, Electronic Arts had an employee PC that was infected. The criminals were able to hoover up all the cookies on that machine, which included their Slack cookie, and that allowed them to impersonate that employee in the internal Slack channel at Electronic Arts and contact the tech support team and ask them to reset the credential for him. And because it was on an internal Slack and the user was logged in, tech support didn't question that person being who they said they were, happily reset the password, which resulted in the FIFA 21 source code being stolen. And when I started looking into this, I'm like, I wonder how long does a criminal have from the day that they steal my cookie until that cookie expires, right? Because if the expiry is low enough, then it's less marketable to steal the cookie from me. And it turns out the default Slack cookie is good for 10 years. So if you're using corporate Slack, make a note to go change the policy. Because if you're using free Slack, you're screwed. It's 10 years. If you're using paid Slack, it is a policy in your enterprise policies for Slack that you can change that. And I would strongly advise you not to set it to 10 years. There have been a lot of markets selling stolen cookies. Fortunately, Genesis Market is no longer with us, but it was a great example, and I put a couple example screenshots up there where you could shop for cookies by like what kind of thing you wanted to steal. And Genesis primarily was actually marketing themselves to teenagers who wanted to buy other people's cookies for games so they can impersonate them or screw with them. They wanted to steal their Steam cookies so they could download all of somebody else's Steam games so they didn't have to buy them. It was largely oriented toward gamers, but we did see criminals using it to acquire corporate and enterprise cookies as well to do attacks like we saw in Electronic Arts. This has, as an industry, this hasn't gone away. Genesis has gone away, but there's a lot of other ones out there. Here's a more recent one I had found called Broker. And again, you can see by industry, you can shop and say, I'm interested in stealing cookies for schools. I'm interested in cookies for people that are in Brazil or Ghana or Canada or wherever, to kind of target different environments and different kind of cookies you want to buy. Pretty much every info stealer out there these days will take all the cookies off your machine once they get on. I mean, fortunately, all of the major browsers do make an effort to encrypt the cookie jar, if you want to call it that, the cookie storage. But of course, the key is there. Otherwise, the browser can't read the cookies. And if you've got the key, it kind of doesn't do any good to encrypt it. So that is pretty much a standard thing. In addition to taking stored passwords, they pretty much always take the cookies. And of course, if you're using a password manager, let's say, I'll say Bitwarden, because that's one of the ones I happen to like and respect. It stores things very safely, but it can't control my cookies. So even if my passwords are safely secured, you can still hoover them up from Firefox or Chrome or Edge or Brave or whatever you're using. YouTube has had a lot of problems with this. Google's really clamping down on this. Google's blocked, they say, over 1.6 million different fishes. People want to take over YouTubers' channels to promote crypto scams and all kinds of random stuff. The criminals realize that Google's monitoring the communications really tightly now, so the first thing they do as a lure is move you into an encrypted side channel that can't be scanned. So they move you into WhatsApp or Telegram or Discord, where it's impossibly filtered if it's end-to-end encrypted, and therefore the provider can't snoop into it. And of course, well, Discord isn't, but Discord's too incompetent to filter them out, and Google is very carefully looking at Gmail to make sure that these scam messages aren't coming through. So they try to migrate you to something else. We've seen them also using Signal and other things as well. Anything that's encrypted end-to-end so that the service provider themselves can't tell that there's a malicious link that's going to take you to the Trojan that's going to steal the cookie off your machine. Again, Google's published a pretty extensive root cause analysis of some of the attacks they've been thwarting. These stolen Google accounts were going for between $3 and $4,000, depending on how many followers your YouTube account has. And that's why now any high follower YouTube account has mandatory multi-factor authentication. Google forces Google accounts to have MFA now if they have more than a certain number of YouTube followers, because they've been such a target of criminals wanting access to those audiences. And as I mentioned, this is just a brief listing of the most common Trojans that are hoovering up cookies. The list continues to grow and grow and grow, but these are the ones we most commonly see in Sophos Labs when we're doing analysis of, the malware samples coming into the lab. And all of them are malware there, with the exception of EvilGenX, which is an open source project that's on GitHub. But we are seeing, I inserted it in here because we are seeing it rise in prominence for bypassing multi-factor as well. So, what do we do now? I mean, Walter had some sage advice, but he's a bit quiet today. The future clearly for most of us is to move toward WebAuthn, and that's really the best way. And this is just a brief kind of description of what it looks like. But the idea here is, when I want to log into Gmail and I want to use my phishing-resistant token, whether that is passkey that's stored on my iPhone, whether that's a YubiKey I happen to keep on my keychain, or a smart card or whatever I'm using, all I'm going to do is send a challenge with my username to Gmail and say, I want to register. And all they get from me is my email address or my username. And then they go, okay, we're going to create a new credential for this person who's registering an account. They send back my username with a challenge. I sign that. I create a new set of keys just to talk to Google. I store it in a little database called google.com. I use that new set of keys I generated to sign that challenge with my response so that they now have my public key. And now the only thing they store is my public key. I store my private key in my credential store. If it's a passkey, it's stored in your secure element on your phone. If it's your YubiKey, there's a little HSM in your YubiKey that it stores it in. And this is dumbing it down a bit. Please don't pick on me, but I'm trying to make it accessible. And then all that Google stores is my public key. And then every time I want to authenticate, I just have to sign their challenge to prove I have the private key and I'm in. And this is phishing resistant because I will only use that key for the domain I stored it for. So somebody would have to take over google.com to get me to sign a challenge from google.com, and impersonating Google's, I think it's pretty difficult. Now, it may not be true for all things you're authenticating to, but that's largely why it's phishing resistant. If you can take over the domain name system and you can get Google's private key to send the challenge to me for the public key that I stored when they signed it, I guess it's possible to bypass, but it's difficult. It increases the bar quite high. And for future visits to my Gmail account, it's a very similar flow, except of course I'm not creating a new account. They just send me a challenge. I sign the challenge to prove I'm who I am, and then they know that. And because it's stored with the domain name again, you can't trick me into giving it to the wrong website. Very similar to your password manager, right? If you store your password in a password manager, it's not going to offer to autofill it for the wrong website, and that's another security measure. And this just takes it to an extreme by using digital signatures as part of that process. Another thing we can look at, right? Like, as we know, EvilGenix is getting more popular. If you're not using WebAuthn, well, how many people are authenticating from the same IP? Because when we see EvilGenix targeted at a given enterprise, they're not typically phishing one employee. They're sending these out to tens, hundreds of employees, and because they're going through a proxy, they generally are all going to come from one IP address. Suddenly, all of my staff are in central Kansas, or also known as geolocation 0,0 in the United States. And that's awful suspicious, right? Like yesterday they were in Seattle and London and Tokyo, and today they're all in Kansas. So this is one of the things we can start to watch for in our authentication systems. If we're not able to use phishing-resistant authentication, we can spot these proxies being deployed in a phishing attack by having an anomalous behavior like that, which is why are all these people suddenly somewhere else? Now, it could be that you're just, now that we all have work from home and stuff, could be we're all having a corporate offsite in Paris, and that's why we're all showing up at the Novotel in London, perhaps. So you're going to get false positives, but at least it gives you a heads up that an attack is underway. It's also an early detection mechanism so that if it is a large-scale phishing attack, you may get this as a way of spotting that it's the beginning of the attack faster than you might get phishing reports from very aware employees who are like, I got this weird email, I'm going to report it. Those processes have a tendency to be somewhat lengthy. This is a very fast way of detecting early stages of an attack. I'm a big fan of the traffic light system. We don't want to put too much friction in place. Like back to the cookie lifetime, right? Maybe I want my staff to have to log in once a day, so I'll set my cookie expiry to 24 hours, but I don't want them to have to pull out their authentication token every hour, even if a 1-hour cookie is probably more secure than a 24-hour cookie. Because back to what's going to happen with that cookie, in all likelihood, the person stealing it is not the person who's going to abuse it. The person stealing it's probably going to put it in a marketplace. It's probably some teenager somewhere trying to figure out if you've got a Steam cookie they can steal. And so you've got some time, right? So maybe 2 days on your cookies. Less than 10 years, more than 2 hours. Somewhere in that range probably, right? But we can also dynamically adjust those policies based on the sensitivity of that application that we're using, right? So doing an inventory of all your applications, especially as you move towards ZTNA and that kind of thing, where you now have granular control of different applications very easily as a security administrator or professional, you can start looking at them and going, you know what, for the wiki, I'll just let the key, the cookies can be a week for the wiki. I'm not as worried about somebody stealing my wiki cookie. But for the HR system, maybe it really is an hour. Maybe every hour I'm willing to force people that are going into the HR system to do things like changing people's salaries or, sensitive things where there's really sensitive information. I want to keep that very low, and I'm willing to take the penalty of a very large amount of friction. But in maybe for committing source code, I'm in the middle somewhere, right? Maybe I want people to do it twice a day instead of once a week. And so by allocating things kind of to a category, you can have some policies, and it doesn't have to be red, yellow, and green. You could have 7 colors if you really like it, but complexity is not the friend of security typically. I'd recommend trying to keep it simple. go out there, inventory your apps, decide on what risk threshold is appropriate for those apps, and then you can implement a staggered policy. Maybe you don't even use multi-factor at all for green apps. Maybe it's fine to just have a username and a password, and you're okay with people logging in that way. But it's a good way of not imposing too much pain for everything, but enough pain to protect the asset that you're looking after. And lastly, some other smart checks. I mean, one of the things that we do internally, and I know a lot of other organizations do, for highly sensitive things, it can only be done from a corporate device that has a corporate certificate on it, in addition to me doing multi-factor with a third device, like my YubiKey or my phone. And that really narrows down and makes that cookie theft thing go away. Like, if I can't commit source code to GitHub unless I'm on a device that has a certificate and you've authenticated as me with multi-factor, you've really raised the bar pretty darn high. Not impossible, but really pretty good. Device health can, of course, be a part of this as well, because cookie theft is usually done by commodity malware, which likely means that device is either unpatched or not protected to your corporate standards, whatever sort of endpoint security you're using is. And in that case, you may want to automatically force that user to use the highest level of security every time they authenticate until that device health returns to normal, because clearly that device is at higher risk of having the cookie stolen if it's in a diminished state. Trusted IP ranges can reduce fatigue if you want to eliminate your office IPs from having stricter standards, but for unknown IPs, things like impossible travel, all these have false positives, right? It's back to thresholds of how much pain you're willing to take. I'm a frequent impossible traveler because I do research from my hotel room, so I'm like logged in from London, but I'm also in Vietnam and Sydney at the same time, and I forget, and IT locks my account because they figure I can't be in London and Vietnam at the same time, which isn't wrong. I mean, Stephen Hawking kind of proved that to us, but it can have false positives, but for the right level of security of certain systems, it may be something you're willing to impose. I know a lot of companies have decided that they just will blacklist China and Russia, and that's going to solve all their problems. We know that that's not true, but I guess it couldn't hurt in some circumstances. But those cookie life, so shortening those TTLs on those cookies, and when you're using enterprise cloud apps, be looking, all of your cloud apps have these settings, and if you haven't reviewed them, go look at your Office 365, go look at your Google Suite or your Slack or all these types of services, because many of them have generously high cookie lifetimes because they want to be a frictionless experience, and friction's not always bad. And of course, modern endpoint security. So those are my thoughts on multi-factor and how we're seeing it compromised and bypassed, and these are the best ideas I could come up with on how to try to look after your multi-factor. And if there's any questions, I don't know if I have time, but I think we're doing okay. I think the microphone is coming up. There was somebody over here, right there, in the middle.
So most of the cases of multi-factor authentication bypasses I've seen have been email compromises through M365, and a good portion of those come from conditional access policies. So have you got any common conditional access policy pitfalls you've seen that have been used to get around?
That is not something I've looked at, so I don't really have an answer for that. But that's a great question that if you want to follow up at lunch, I might reach out to my colleagues internally and see if they've got any advice, because I'm familiar with the risk there, but I don't have any good advice. Thanks for the question, though. Is there anybody else with any questions? Hopefully this man's I'll have an answer. I don't know.
So what's your opinion on SSO, and whether would you choose to have your entire organization using one set of credentials, but then that prevents writing down passwords and stuff? Or would you rather have your organization be tackled with MFA for every platform they end up signing up to?
Sorry, I didn't hear the last part.
Would you choose rather using MFA for every single platform that they are signing up during their working hours, or would you rather go for SSO and one set of credentials?
Yeah, SSO is like it's a blessing and a curse, right? Like it's how most of us are going to force MFA into our processes by having a centralized identity store that we can have policies on, right? But obviously it is the steal one key to unlock the entire org problem. And, I mean, ideally you can, back to these, cookie lifetimes, I mean, you're going to have a separate cookie even if it's single sign-on for most things. So you could set conditional access policies that are different even if you're using single sign-on for different services. I mean, in the end, it has to be, users will outstupid anything you do, the webcam and the RSA token, right? Like, we have to make things easy enough and just accept the risks. So I think SSO is probably the answer, and you just have to put more of your eggs in the monitoring for compromise basket, with the understanding that that's a risk, right? Because tools have to be usable. I mean, normies just aren't going to do things the way we want them to do them. If we make it too hard, they will outdumb it.
Thank you.
Anyone else? There's this gentleman up here.
Thank you for a really good talk. What's your prediction on when we'll finally be able to ditch passwords? And do you think FIDO2 is kind of the Kool-Aid magic answer to that? As somebody clumsy with my keys and phone, often I don't think it is.
I think passkeys might be our savior if we can just get everyone to adopt them. And it seems like Google and Apple in particular are going to bully all of us into using them whether we want to or not, and that might help. And passkeys are not a panacea, of course, because the way we make passkeys usable, if you're not familiar with passkeys, in essence, it's a software version of a FIDO token that uses your phone's biometric as the second factor, as opposed to carrying a USB drive or a Bluetooth thing or a smart card or this kind of thing. And to make them usable, Apple and Google and Microsoft back up your private keys to the cloud so that when you drop your iPhone in the toilet, you're not locked out of your accounts. And that obviously presents a vulnerability, because then if somebody can authenticate to your cloud provider that you're using to store your passkeys, they can impersonate you. But it's a heck of a lot better than any password anybody has ever used. So, and it's very, very usable, right? And it's the kind of thing that, back to, my parents cannot use most multi-factor. It's too complicated for them. But if it's as easy as the login page saying, unlock your iPhone to log into Gmail, they know how to do that. And so it's about usability again versus security. And I think passkeys are going to be the answer. The problem is, of course, all of us have seen the ridiculous password policies, even on sites that shouldn't have them. There's no good unifying. It's not like we're all going to suddenly adopt it, right? Like Google and Apple and Facebook and Meta and X and whatever are all going to have it, this year, and we'll be able to use passkeys. But unfortunately, your bank and your retirement account and a million other things aren't going to have it, or won't have it for 5 years, or maybe they'll have it in, it'll still let you bypass it by telling them the name of your first car. We have a lot of issues to deal with here, but I think the passwordless future at least seems real to me. Like, passkeys is the most usable, the most secure way for a regular person to safely use their accounts that has existed yet. And it's the only one that I think the friction's low enough that normal people are like, yeah, this is all right. So now that we have the technology, we all just need to be evangelists and lobby our own companies to implement it in our web solutions. If you're a developer or you're a company that provides software applications, perpetually ask your financial institutions why they don't have it yet, and be an advocate for it, because I think it's the most usable, sensible answer we're going to have. And for those of you that do have tokens, the great thing about passkeys is it uses the same WebAuthn backend as every other part of the U2F ecosystem, which means when I go to a passkey site, I can actually use my YubiKey as an authentication to a site that supports passkeys, but somebody who doesn't have a YubiKey can just use their phone. And so it's great, because I can use the more secure hardware that I want to use to secure my account, but you can fall back to your phone if that's okay for you.
Do you not worry about personal users having to, say, use their personal iCloud to manage their passkeys, perhaps misconfiguring that and, say, sharing an iCloud account with their child, for example?
Oh yeah, that's going to happen. I mean, this is the vulnerability of passkeys, right? Like the private keys are stored somewhere that somebody can access them, whether it's the child or the criminal. But it's still better than, I can't even come up with a password absurd enough to explain what most people are using today, right? Like it's their sports team. It's like anything is better than what we're doing. So I would still take that risk. I will wrap up at that point. Thank you. If any of you want to chat, I'll be here most of the day. Come see me at lunch.